welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I am the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. Today with us, we have Jeffrey James Higgins. He's a retired supervisory special agent with the DAA, and he's currently an acclaimed author who writes thrillers, short stories, scripts, creative nonfiction, and as well as essays. He has a very exciting life story, having had the experience of wrestling a suicide bomber, fighting the Taliban in combat, and chasing terrorists across 5 continents. And we'll hear a little bit about that today. He received the Attorney General's Award for Exceptional Heroism and the DA Award of Valor. He's been interviewed by top-notch media, by CNN, National Geographic, New York Times. He's a #1 Amazon best-selling author, and he has won 18 literary awards, including the Claim Award, Pencraft's Best Fiction Book of 2022, and a Reader's Favorite Gold Medal. And he is currently working on an exciting new project, but we'll hear more about it in the end. Today, we will be discussing not only his literary and DA experiences and his background, including a story that made it into the Narco-verse episode, and has very, very current ramifications, not only about the parallels between the Taliban during Jeffrey's active years and today, when it's back in power, but also ramifications of a different angle of the war on drugs, the crisis that has come with the opioid epidemic and with the fentanyl crisis in the US, and how those are similar or different from the heroin-induced crisis from the Taliban and various terrorist organizations and warlords capitalizing on those sorts of drugs that we are a little bit more familiar with. Jeffrey, thank you so much for joining the program. It's good to have you.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
And before we get into the heavy-duty stuff about drugs and whether war on drugs is a success or failure, neither or both, let's talk about a little bit about yourself. What got you into DA and that sort of activity, and how did you end up in those some of the exciting situations you mentioned in your bio?
Well, I started as a journalist, and I was between reporters' jobs when I took a job as a private investigator, and I was exposed to people who were interested in law enforcement, which I'd never really been exposed to before. And I figured I'd do it for a while because I knew I'd be a writer. I always wanted to be a writer since the time I was a little kid, and I figured what great fodder for writing. And I got into law enforcement, then realized it was something I really cared about. So I worked as a police officer for about 5 years, and I was a detective. I worked in patrol and auto theft task force. I worked in street crimes.
I am so sorry. I just realized. Oh, yeah, fine. It's good, sorry.
It's okay. Yeah, no. So I spent 5 years as a police officer doing everything from patrol to organized crime, and then I joined DEA and I did federal investigations for 20 plus years. I started in New York City where I was going after transnational criminal groups. And then after 9/11, I was one of the first people to get to the North Tower after it collapsed on 9/11. I ended up going to Afghanistan. I volunteered to help set up our office there. And then I worked for DEA for 20 plus years. I was in our foreign advisory support teams, our FAST teams, which was DEA's international tactical team. And I worked in our narco-terrorism group, going after high-value targets around the world and bringing them back to the U.S. for prosecution. So I was really fortunate. I had a varied, law enforcement career, all the way from driving a patrol car in Tampa, Florida, to literally arresting the biggest drug trafficker in the history of U.S. prosecution. So I was fortunate to be able to work with the people I did and actually do some good.
So the drug trafficker you mentioned, Bacho, that he was the subject of a documentary investigative episode on Narco-Wars, and I had an opportunity to watch it, and I hope our viewers and listeners do as well. I'm not going to rehash every detail of that and every detail of the investigation because it's worth watching. But at the end of the day, when, spoiler alert, you successfully captured him, one disturbing note was about the U.S. side of things, which is basically there was some procedural issue that allowed the narco-terrorism charge against this guy to be dropped, and he's supposed to be out this year, actually. Can you tell us exactly how that happened and what to expect to happen once he is finally released?
Yeah, I have to be careful how I talk about it because it involves classified
Sure.
information. But the gist of it was there was information that a negative information about a witness that we used in the trial that another agency was in possession of, which we didn't know about. And so we didn't make it part, we didn't show it to the defense during the trial. So because of that, we would have had to do a retrial, but witnesses were dead and the situation has changed significantly and the cost of a trial and, a dozen other factors made that impossible.
That's quite incredible and a little bit disturbing in itself. What is going to happen to him once he is released? Is he going to go back to Afghanistan? Do you expect him to take a position with the current Taliban-led regime?
Yeah,
Or
I expect him to absolutely do that. I mean, he was the world's most prolific drug trafficker in the history of the world. His organization distributed Afghan heroin to 22 countries that we could prove. The year that we arrested him, we seized ledgers that showed there was over $261 million in wholesale heroin that he sold, which would had it all gone like overseas, it would have been worth about $8 billion that year, just his organization alone. He was responsible for over 20% of the world's heroin, or rough, maybe 19.7% to be specific, but about 20% of the world's heroin. And I didn't even have all the ledgers to show the how vast his organization really was. And he supported the Taliban. He helped them recruit. He provided them with logistics. He purchased weapons for them. He beyond the zakat, the 10% religious offering that a lot of drug traffickers in Afghanistan and the Muslim world provide. He went beyond that and supported them in a number of ways. So yeah, I mean, I think he'll be lauded as a hero in Afghanistan, which is now a massive narco state. Afghanistan is like what Nassau was to the pirates, back in the 17 and 1800s. It's a lawless place run by the worst terrorists in the world. The highest concentration of terrorists in the world are in Afghanistan and around Afghanistan. And our pullout from that country is a disaster, not just for the Afghan people and the millions of women that are in servitude and the American allies that we abandoned, but for us and for the world and countries that are going to suffer as a result of these terrorists having a free area to train and plan.
now, this is a very important foundation for our discussion because I don't think there is a lot of the people have a very clear understanding about the relationship between narco traffickers and terrorists. We hear the word narco-terrorism being thrown around a lot. We certainly understand that terrorists use drugs for funding of their other activities. But how these relationships works precisely, I think, is fairly poorly understood. Are these drug traffickers partners, proxies, employees, or occasional contacts for these groups? With the subjects, you are describing this relationship that goes far beyond transactional. He seemed to be ideologically aligned with the Taliban, or at least happy enough to provide them with the full service, basically package, not just the drugs. How would you characterize that relationship?
Well, it might help. I mean, when we use terms like narco-terrorism, right, it might help to define it. I essentially break it down into four major categories. And the first category of narco-terrorism is classic narco-terrorism. And that's like you think El Chapo or you think, Pablo Escobar in Colombia. And that's a drug trafficking group whose goal is to make money. And they use violence by targeting judges and prosecutors and the public to create terror as a way of furthering their business interests and increasing their profits, right? That's classical. Then there's ideological terrorism. And this is where you have ideologically driven groups like the Taliban who are using revenues from drug sales as a way to further their goals. And so they are in drug trafficking or involved with drug trafficking because they're trying to do something else, trying to engage in jihad, for example. And I investigated like a Taliban commander who was directly involved in large scale heroin transactions as a way to fund weapons purchases. So that's an example of like ideological terrorism. Then there's this rare instance where you have traffickers who are also terrorists, right? They have a foot in both camps. And Khan Mohammed was the first ever narco-terrorism arrest. It was one of my cases. And Khan Mohammed was an opium and heroin trafficker to make money, but he was also a jihadist. So he also worked with the Taliban and was looking to corrupt the government and to bring Islamic rule back into Afghanistan. So he was an active member of the Taliban and an active drug trafficker, but that's more of a rare, foot in each camp type of trafficker. But the most common way you see narco-terrorism expressed is through a symbiotic relationship between drug traffickers and terrorists. That's where they both stay in their lane, but they work together to further the other's goals, right? So, as an example, in Afghanistan, you would have drug traffickers who are aiding the Taliban by guiding them through drug routes through the mountains, for example, right? Using their guides when the Taliban would come into Afghanistan from Pakistan, from where they were hiding in Pakistan. The drug traffickers would facilitate, charging their phones, giving them ammunition, feeding them, letting them stay at their laboratories high in the mountains, and then driving them to attacks and helping them orchestrate their attacks. So basically, providing like some structural form for them when they got into Afghanistan to commit attacks. And then the Taliban would offer protection for these labs, right? They would subvert the rule of law in these areas, in these outlying provinces. They would target informants and anyone working for the Afghan government. So they would create an environment in which the drug traffickers could work more freely. So together, and the traffickers, would pay them direct money. They would pay them the zakat I mentioned. They would pay them, percentages of their drugs. And even sometimes purchase weapons for them. So they had this relationship where the two of them were working together, even though they both had different goals. And I would even add, those are like the four major categories of narco-terrorism, but I would even add like state-sponsored narco-terrorism, where states are using drug trafficking to further their national goals. And we could argue that China's involved in this to some extent. And also when trafficking itself is the form of terrorism. So, the Khan Mohammed was one of the terrorists I mentioned earlier, the first one we arrested for narco-terrorism. He mentioned, whether it was like through I can't remember the exact quote, but something like whether it's through bullets or drugs, it's all our jihad. And so understanding that the drugs that they're giving to their enemy is a way to bring jihad to the enemy. So those are, when we talk about narco-terrorism, those are sort of the areas that we talk about, and it certainly evolved and changed, post 9/11, in how we look at narco-terrorism.
Very interesting point, and it creates a lot of potential complications for interagency cooperation, as I can imagine. The episode describes how the military prefer to stay out of the drug trafficking realm and focus on their specific combat missions, and how GA cooperated with the local police to investigate and make arrests. To what extent did other agencies come into the picture, for instance, on the terrorist end, and how did that sort of cooperation work or didn't work in general terms?
So, initially, like in Afghanistan, the military was reluctant to get involved in any kind of counter drug mission because it's a slippery slope, right? And Afghanistan provides 90% of the world's heroin. So for the military to get directly involved in those missions would basically have no end and would have drawn away resources that were going. It was hard enough with Iraq and Afghanistan happening at the same time for them to get the resources they needed. I can say that it certainly changed over the years that I was there. I got there in 2004. And I was there for much of the time between 2004 and 2010. There were operations that the military did that had a strong drug focus. Like in 2009, I was part of Operation Siege Engine, which was that we took over Marja, which was in the center, the crossroads of Helmand, which is in the south of Afghanistan. And Helmand is one of the biggest poppy producing and opium producing and heroin producing provinces in Afghanistan. there are more hectares under poppy production in Afghanistan than anywhere in the world. And the Taliban was also using Helmand as one of their strong points. So this was basically the Taliban's headquarters in Helmand. And so we had a bunch of special forces teams and the FAST team, my DEA tactical team, together with some Afghan counterparts. And we flew in at night and took over this Taliban stronghold. And then for the first time since the beginning of the war, we actually held it. Instead of going in on a night operation, taking something out and then leaving before dawn, we held it for days. And the Taliban tried for several days to take it back from us. So they were streaming across the border, fighting. So I mean, it was the biggest special operation since the war had started, since the initial invasion. And a lot of Taliban were killed during it. We were in contact with the enemy for days. But it was also the biggest seizure of opium in history, right? So that was a strong counter narcotics and counter terrorist operation. Like there were this crossroads, and one quadrant at this crossroads was all Iranian weapons and maps and strategic materials and ammunition and suicide vests. And then the other three quadrants were all drug related, with this huge amounts of opium that were for sale. So the military's role did change. And by the way, even prior to that, I mean, for decades, the military has worked with DEA in places like Central and South America to help target traffickers and things. So it's not that the military's not involved with it. It was just at that time period after the invasion of Afghanistan, trying to use the limited resources that they had, but they were reluctant. Now, the other agencies, so I worked for a drug enforcement agency, right? And so the DEA, Drug Enforcement Administration, is solely focused. It's a single mission agency. But I'm libertarian, so I actually believe in the legalization of most drugs. But I always focus on transnational criminals and hit crews and the violence that's associated with it. But after 9/11, I vowed when I was standing there in the rubble of the World Trade Center that I was going to use my investigative skills to go after the people who did that and go after terrorists. So that's really, I really tried to push my agency into counterterrorism for years. And even when I got to Afghanistan that first year, I was the assistant country attaché, and we had a very small office, and we were developing intelligence and trying to train the locals and put together operations. And everything we did showed the connection between every case we had, or almost every case we had a connection between drugs and terrorism. So much so that we were really just focused on terrorists and then using the drugs as a tool to go after them. But I had like high level meetings with members of the intelligence community and the diplomatic community who were telling me there was no connection between drugs and terrorism, which was clearly not true by all the evidence that we had. But those were the initial arguments that I had. And it may be part of that. We don't, where other agencies didn't want to get sucked into it as well. But that denial took years to overcome. And that's why I made it my goal to make that first narco-terrorism case. I mean, based on the intelligence that we had in Afghanistan, Congress passed the narco-terrorism law. It's 21 USC 960A, which based on that nexus we showed between terrorism and drugs. And so now it's very common for people to understand the connection. But for years, trying to get people within the US government to acknowledge it was very difficult.
Well, it comes from the same school of thought, I suppose, that denies any possible, to this day, and I met such people, any possible collusion between Sunni-backed and Shia-backed terrorist groups or ideological groups, which obviously exist. Speaking of which, you just mentioned the presence of the Iranian weapons even fairly early on. And one of the things that we've heard about on occasion is that Hezbollah, was one of the major clients of the Taliban, but it was never a big subject of discussion. Even to this day, there's very little understanding at what point Iran has gotten involved in supporting or engaging with the Taliban, because we've only heard about it in their a year or two leading up to the withdrawal, not during most of this time, and certainly not a lot about Hezbollah's engagement with the Taliban in transactional relations. Can you talk a little bit more about that? To what extent was that a factor?
When people think about the Sunni Shia rift, right, they all that they tend to focus on is the sectarian violence and the opposing goals. But those are secondary to the common goals that they share. So when you're talking about Islamists, whether they're Sunni or Shia going after infidels, that's something they all share, and they've supported each other on this for centuries. And I highly recommend the book, The Secret Apparatus by Cynthia Farahat, where she goes in and lists all of the evidence for this going back, hundreds of years. But in Afghanistan, I mean, very clearly the Iranians were supporting the Taliban. There were Taliban troops that were in Iran training. There was a pipeline of weapons coming out of Iran into Afghanistan. It's the enemy of my enemy, right? Like that. It's that whole strategy obviously is true, and it's true all over the world. Hezbollah is involved in drug trafficking. Hezbollah is involved in counterfeiting and all types of crimes. It's a massive state-sponsored criminal organization, and that the Taliban received constant support. By the way, not just from Iran, but from other actors who were also wanted to see the U.S. suffer. So it's the enemies of our country are happy to come together wherever they can find a flashpoint and cause us distress. And whether that's true, whether you're talking about China or North Korea or Iran or any of our global adversaries.
Very interesting that angle that really didn't come much to the forefront at all, and certainly not fairly recently. But another interesting aspect of that is that Taliban, for whatever reason, even before it took power most recently, was not really treated as a designated terrorist organization in the same way Hamas or Hezbollah were. Why is there such a difference towards the Taliban from other similar quasi-military organizations?
Well, the reason is politics, right? But it defies logic and reason. The Pakistan Taliban's designated. I mean, you even saw it in the U.S. withdrawal, right? This horrible botched withdrawal. You saw, whether people believe we should have left or not, the way we left was just an absolute disaster, and it was done purely for a political reason to get out by the 20-year anniversary of 9/11. That's what the Biden administration talked about over and over and over again. The Afghans only asked for a few more months so they could replace contractors, so they could not have the U.S. rush out of Afghanistan, so that they could get out of the fighting season. When the passes are closed during winter because of the snows, the fighting subsides significantly. And we couldn't even do that because we were trying, this administration was trying to have a political win by showing that they got out by this anniversary. So it was an arbitrary date in many ways, without any like strategic reason to get out by that point. So I mean, I don't think we should have gotten out at all. Fighting over there and having an intelligence base and a platform to launch drones and a platform to launch human intelligence it's so important, it can't be overstated. And the fact is that this highest concentration of terrorists in the world is in this area, and now it's like a black hole for us. We're very limited in what intelligence we have, and worse, we've betrayed our allies once again. And so the people that we have over there have no motivation to work with us or to help us. I mean, this will become a problem just like it was before 2001. It will be. That's what their goal is, and it's just where will the attacks happen, right? But how will we go back, right? You have like $80 billion or whatever the number was of 80, was it $80 million? I can't remember. A huge amount of military equipment that was abandoned there. Just an insane amount that's in the hands of these terrorist groups now. Our allies that we abandoned were being hunted around the country. People who worked in the military, the Afghan police. I have photos of people that I indicted coming out of the houses of the people that worked with us, searching for them in Afghanistan. I spent a year getting calls from people from Afghanistan every night, telling me about the atrocities that were going on and begging for help. I mean, we abandoned somewhere between 9 and 15,000 American citizens over there, but it was all the allies that we had and the people that we worked with that we abandoned. I mean, it was the worst thing I've ever seen in American foreign policy. And there's been some bad stuff, but that was the worst by far. And you'll notice it just disappeared from the media, who really just act as a propaganda arm of the Democratic National Party. And you would think that something like that wouldn't have as much to do with partisan politics, because it's national defense, right? And it's something we could talk about, but it literally just disappeared from the headlines. I mean, when was the last time you read an article about what's happening to women being raped in the streets in Afghanistan, or the starvation that's going on? I mean, we're looking at giving them aid. We're looking at giving aid to the Taliban-run government, who still talks about jihad being their number one goal. These are literally the same people who attacked us on 9/11, 2001. These are the same people that are running this government were involved with the Taliban back then. They've never stopped. They were responsible. The Taliban itself, there's Haqqani network, and the Haqqanis are part of the government now in Afghanistan. These groups that were responsible for murdering Americans and other coalition members for years we're now talking about sending money to them. I mean, it's just insane. Like you have to get so twisted into the politics of something to try to come up for a rationale for one, abandoning a country like that, and two, now pretending that somehow the Taliban is ideologically different than ISIS. When I was there, we had commanders who would work for the Taliban, and then there'd be an ISIS group. They join the ISIS group. It's all the same. There's different commanders with different loyalties, right? Different warlords that the people on the ground in the Taliban actually work for, but their ultimate goals are all pretty much the same. There's minor differences in what they're seeking to achieve, or the strategy they're using to get there. But maybe it's different tactics between ISIS and the Taliban in some instances. Many instances it's exactly the same, and killing Americans is at the top of their list. But the overall strategy and the overall goals are no different. They're all radical Islamists. They all seek the same thing. And a lot of it's more internal power struggles than anything else. And this idea that somehow, I mean, I heard it in the mainstream media that the Taliban that we've been fighting for years is actually seeking peace and actually wants to we can deal with them, and they're coming back to the table. And it's like, I mean, half of the people in that government are indicted, for terrorism. Like these are people on watch lists. I mean, it's as terrorist as you could possibly get. And unfortunately, if you have a media that's acting as a political pawn as well, they're not telling the truth to the American people. And who has time to really study these issues? People tend to hear something and believe it, unfortunately. And this is one of those cases when it's just so backwards. I would have to think that the average American hears this talk and just something doesn't feel right. Something feels Orwellian about us talking about partnering or allying with these people or working with the Taliban when we've been fighting them for years. I mean, there must be some cognitive dissonance that pops up in people's minds when they hear this doublespeak that's coming out of the Biden administration.
I find it interesting because one of the justifications for withdrawal, first of all, it was, oh, well, the Americans are tired of the war, although what that means exactly, I never quite understood. What does it mean, Americans are tired? I didn't see mass anti-war demonstrations regarding the war in Afghanistan at any point in the 20 years. Not in the beginning, and not in the middle, and not even at the end. There wasn't mass popular outpouring of interest or disinterest or opposition to the war or to our presence there. So to me, that seems to be misleading about U.S. Attitude towards that particular operation. But another justification that to me was simply quite as implausible was bring our troops home. So I understand the sentiment on a human level, I really do. But essentially what we're saying is that our military and our agencies whose duty is to address security issues and who are signing up for these jobs specifically to do that, they should not be doing their job, basically. That the job is finished.
It's not the military that want it to come home, right? They're claiming there's public sentiment to bring people home. It all when you poll people to it depends on how you phrase the poll, right? But I mean, the people don't think about Afghanistan, they don't care about Afghanistan. The point is we're still in country since World War II, right? It's about the projection of power. It's about having intelligence platforms around the world. It's about being able to quickly respond to threats as they come up. Not to mention the whole humanitarian aspect of this. I mean, there's an entire country now that's been subjected to radical Islamic law. women aren't in school, women are being forced to cover up again. 12-year-old girls were being pulled out of houses and forced to marry, to become jihadist brides. This is horrible, horrible stuff. A whole country now is starving, basically, and it's being run by a terrorist group. So the humanitarian side alone should have prevented us from completely withdrawing. Also, leaving our allies. These are Afghans who stood up and risked their lives and fought side by side with Americans. I'm talking about civilians in the government, as well as soldiers and informants and people who worked with the police. They're all targeted once the Taliban came over. I mean, these are people whose families have been slaughtered, they've been slaughtered. They've had to flee the country, and we pulled out so fast. I mean, the way we set up the military defense in Afghanistan was a series of bases that would be supplied by air. Right, it's a mountainous country. There's only a handful of roads, so we set up the defense. And then when we pulled out so rapidly, we even forbade U.S. contractors from continuing to work with the Afghan military. So they ran out of gas for the airplanes. They ran out of ammunition. They couldn't feed their troops. That's why it collapsed in like a week, because they literally, and we knew it was coming, and President Ghani had asked President Biden to just give them time to find European contractors, to find other people who could come in and support them. And the answer was no, because we had this political deadline of getting out by the 20-year anniversary of 9/11. I mean, it's just so horrific. And it'll go down as the worst thing in American foreign policy, but we are going to get attacked again because of this. This is this huge group of terrorists, right? Different terror groups, from the Haqqani network to the Taliban, right? There's dozens of them that are in this area, but they're all singularly focused on what they want to do, even though some of their goals or their tactics and how they do it changes. And now they have this home base. They have this place where they can now be funded by our other enemies. Qatar funds terrorism around the world. It's the number one states funding terrorism in the world. And now you have a place where people can train. You have a place. I mean, we have an open border right now, and lots of Afghans have been caught coming across our border, right? How can you give them a place where they can't be touched? We don't know what's happening. They have training, planning, and then we're letting people come into our country as well. Like this, if you look at all these things individually, each one is bad, but when you put them all together, it's really bad, and we are going to get hit. And then what do we do? How do you go back to Afghanistan? Just pragmatically, how do we send a force back to Afghanistan? Because are we expecting to get any kind of help from any Afghan civilians or people that previously helped us and we abandoned? I can't imagine that. I mean, maybe their desire to shed the yoke of this horrible tyrannical regime would be enough for them to still join forces with us, but it certainly won't be to the extent they did before, and they know they can't trust us to stay. So we're in a much worse place now than we were before we went in the first time.
You've had the experience you mentioned of fighting with the suicide bomber. Was it in Afghanistan? What can you tell us about the mentality of such people, and is it still a factor within the Islamist circles there? Do they still employ this sort of tactics, and if so, for what purpose?
Yeah, I mean, they still do, right? They still do it with the Palestinians, right? People go on suicide missions. It's the ideological and theological belief, right? That you're doing something for God, that you're giving your life for God, so you get the virgins and this afterlife. But it's young, poor people who are manipulated. I mean, you never see a Taliban leader strapping on a suicide vest. It's always somebody else they get to do that for them. But yeah, I was in Afghanistan 4 days when my partner at the time, Tim Sellers, had found a cell that they previously killed a bunch of Germans at the airport in Kabul, and that they were building IEDs and planning some other attacks. And so he infiltrated one of his sources into them, and the two of us went with ISAF, the International Security Assistance Forces, and we set up a meeting with one of our sources to try to arrest these guys. And the meeting place switched from one side of the river to the other, and they couldn't turn this military force around. So my partner and I were in a car following the bomber who was carrying this bomb, and we couldn't, and he was getting ready to board a bus. So we jumped out and we tackled him and we fought with him while he had a detonator in his pocket and he was trying to detonate the bomb. And we drew a huge crowd. It was right in the vicinity of one of the biggest mosques in Kabul. And we had a huge crowd like throwing bottles and yelling and coming in. They saw two Westerners fighting with what looked like an Afghan guy. He was actually a Pakistani. And they had a military helicopter had to fly right above the deck over our heads just to clear the crowd back from us until we could get some support in the military. We had a Norwegian team that came in and assisted us. And then we went later that night and we hit the headquarters from this place and we seized a bunch of bomb making equipment and explosives. And I think we arrested about a dozen terrorists that were involved with this cell. But yeah, that was like my fourth day in Afghanistan, and things didn't slow down much after that.
You mentioned that the guy was Pakistani, and you also mentioned that the Taliban is designated as a terrorist organization in Pakistan. They've been having all sorts of security issues, but at the same time, Pakistan is known for giving open air to various Islamist schools of thought and mosques and ideological extremist groups that basically feed into that and make it a ripe recruiting ground for Taliban and similar minded extremists. So the question is, how do they balance this approach, on the other hand, appearing to be security minded and recognizing that the Taliban is absolutely a group that uses terrorist methods, but on the other hand, allowing extremism to proliferate ideologically and taking no action? Where does Pakistan actually stand on this issue?
Well, I think the mistake is thinking of it as the Pakistan government is like a monolithic organization, because it's not. There's always been a tension between the military and the civilian government, for one. Of course, then there's the partisan infighting within both of those. But like the ISID, the Pakistan Intelligence Service, has these essentially like these four major components that are siloed, and one of them completely support. They formed the Taliban, right? That they were the ones who initially formed the Taliban, and so you have strong ideological components within parts of the ISID, also within their military intelligence. When I was there, we had intelligence about Pakistan military intelligence accompanying Taliban commanders in Afghanistan and teaching them in demolitions and helping them plan and execute their operations. These are actual members of the Pakistan military. We had the ISID doing the same thing. They were running the war out of their offices, out of Pakistan military and intelligence offices in Pakistan. So Afghan military commanders would cross the border, be tasked by members of the ISID, and then return to Afghanistan to carry out the attacks. And for a while there, if the attack was big enough and successful enough, the Taliban commanders were concerned, because if they returned to Pakistan, sometimes they never came back. And they were because they knew who was ordering these attacks. I mean, we were getting this intelligence over and over and over again from different sources, from people who'd been in training with the Taliban, from actual members of the Taliban, and from people who were in contact with the ISID and military intelligence in Pakistan. So, it's not that the government was doing a thing; it's elements within the government were doing something. So, I mean, they also the overall Pakistan also suffers from radical Islamic extremism, and if you look in the federally administered tribal areas, and you look at, there's large swaths of Pakistan that are not really under their federal government control.
So during the most of the years that U.S. was positioned in Afghanistan, there were plenty of media coverage about the narco-trafficking situation and the drugs and the warlords and all of that. Since the time of withdrawal, all of that coverage of the drugs aspect of Afghanistan not only stopped, but I've actually seen articles stating that the Taliban now is cracking down on the drugs. To what extent is that true? Because I literally hear nothing about drugs in Afghanistan these days. Is that still a factor?
Yeah, of course it's a factor. I mean, 90% of the world's heroin comes out of Afghanistan. And now that the government that we were backing in Afghanistan is gone, there's no one to stop them. And it's not even ideologically forbidden in Islam, in radical Islam, the most fundamental form of Islam. It's not even forbidden for them to use drugs as a tool of jihad. That's something that they can absolutely use, and many of them articulate that that's what they're doing when they sell drugs and they traffic in drugs. So a lot of people point to the Taliban banning drugs and like, was it 99 or 90, early on. But there's a strong argument to be made they were doing it to control market forces at the time. But Afghanistan, the Taliban has been taking proceeds from drug trafficking for decades now, and it's one of it's the biggest money makers in Afghanistan, which is a narco state. And you can argue that for a country to rely so heavily on like illicit trafficking is bad in the long term, right? Because it creates a shadow economy, and it pulls money into black markets. It takes money away from the tax base, and it creates corruption, and there's a whole host of reasons why like an illicit trade like narcotics can actually severely damage an economy over time. But if the government itself is engaged in it, then it takes on a different flavor. At that point, and like you can even look at China now, right, and understand that you have this, roughly $40 billion opioid industry in the world, and China has the majority of it. And talk about how much of an economic benefit that can be for the country itself, while at the same time costing their global adversaries like the United States billions in dollars in fighting drugs, and in lost wages from people who are using drugs. And it certainly is not something that they have any reason to stop. And China, for example, as a collectivist society, doesn't have the same value on individual personal life that you'd see in the West. So even the 2% or whatever that we believe that of the Chinese population that has a drug problem, why would that matter, to the Chinese communists? Why would they care? If it's hurting their enemies, why they really have no motivation to stop. And even if they wanted to stop like the illicit opioid production that's going on there, it's difficult for them, and they have such an administratively fractured society.
I actually really want to get to that part of the discussion, but my question before I get into that, there's been talks of normalizing, of recognizing the Taliban formally, not just for the humanitarian aid purposes, supposedly, but also just for general integration and economic purposes and whatever else. What impact, if that is to happen, if US and eventually others are to formally recognize the Taliban, what impact do you think it will have on drug trade, terrorism, and other illicit activities that the Taliban is engaged in?
Even conceptually, right? If you're going to recognize the Taliban as a legitimate government, and the purpose is because you want to be able to give them humanitarian aid. I understand the humanitarian part of it, but you can't give. I mean, if Al Qaeda is running a small country and they're not doing it well, do we want to send Al Qaeda billions of dollars? And there's no difference. There's some of the very people who are Taliban commanders, the people who are in charge of the government right now, were fighting and killing U.S. troops. These are radical Islamic terrorists. And by the way, the number one target of radical Islamic terrorists are Muslims who are moderate, who don't believe in that form of radicalism. Around the world, more Muslims are killed by Islamic terrorists than anybody. But so it's not an anti-Islam thing, it's an anti-radical Islam thing, right? Where people who believe in the use of terrorism to further the goals. And the Taliban's goal, as they will tell you over and over and over again, is a worldwide Islamic caliphate. It's no different than Al Qaeda. It's no different than ISIS. It's literally just some different personalities and some different tactics on how they want to do it. You'll have side-by-side terror groups where one wants to be more aggressive than the other, and one sees like a slower plod as more effective, where the other one thinks it has to be more aggressive. Like take the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, right? This is a worldwide radical Islamic group, and through the secret apparatus that they use, which is in the secret apparatus, they have different strategies in different places. So in places like Afghanistan, it's kill the enemy, run suicide bombers, right? In places like Europe, they can't be as aggressive, so it's more like jihad through immigration. It's through taking over local governments. It's through having no-go zones. I mean, these are their articulated strategies. And then in the U.S., it's more about disinformation, and it's about more infiltration of media and academia and government. And it's a slow build, because if they start blowing up suicide bombers in downtown Washington, there's going to be a huge reaction against them. So that's one organization in different places sponsoring different strategies, right? And they're doing that for strategic and tactical reasons. And then you see the same thing, the differences between ISIS and the Taliban. Many of the ISIS commanders used to be Taliban commanders. They just moved over to this new organization. So this idea, like when we were pulling out, that we were using the Taliban to protect us from ISIS, is so insane. That is just such an insane statement, and justified to me. Yeah, I would love to hear any American politician explain to me the ideological difference between Al Qaeda and the Taliban. I'd love to hear it, because it does not exist.
So for a long time, these counterterrorism initiatives that we had were very much went hand in hand with the so-called war on drugs. And there's been a lot of libertarian rhetoric on how that was a complete failure, and the importation of drugs continued. And the places like Afghanistan ensured that they would continue no matter what the laws banning them would do in the US or somewhere else. Do you agree with that? Was it in fact a failure? Was it ever possible to shut down drug trade from places like Afghanistan?
It's certainly possible. I mean, what is it? But there are two questions there. One, is it possible? Yes, of course, right? We handcuffed ourselves in Afghanistan, and we tried this Afghanization of the process, and we stopped doing night raids, and we decided that tearing down poppy fields and eradication was a problem because of poppy farmers who'd already taken out loans. And, we just handcuffed ourselves over and over and over again, not going after leadership that was right across the border in Pakistan is a problem. I mean, but is it possible? Of course it's possible. You can never fully eradicate any criminal activity, but you can certainly control it, right? We control all types of criminal activity. But then this first part of that, you said, though, is the war a failure? It's controlled more than it would be in some ways, right? But when you make drugs illegal, there's lots of like unintended negative outcomes. Because it's illegal, there's no quality control, right? So if you were buying heroin from CVS, the dosage would be exactly what you were getting, right? Just like any other drug. It's coming from a major pharmaceutical that can be sued, and that there's all kinds of compliance in place. But you're not getting it from them. You're getting it from the MS-13 gang that's operating on the corner. And the quality controls, that's why the overdose deaths are through the roof. Last year, I think there was over 109,000 overdose deaths. And I saw in the media people who talk about, but the rates is decreasing. It's still increasing significantly, right? I mean, that number back in right before the pandemic, like 2019, I think it was like 70,000 overdose deaths, and it's 109,000, in 2022, 3 years later. Huge increase in overdose deaths. And but you can't just say that, right? Because it's the media again. So it's all about narrative. So you have to say, but wow, it's the rate of increase has slowed. So we're doing really great. I mean, it's a huge epidemic. It's horrible though. The southern border being open as it is has just allowed all kinds of fentanyl to come in. I'm a huge pro-immigration fan. I believe in letting people in, but they have to be vetted, and you certainly have to see what they're bringing across. You can't let terrorists come across, and we've caught numerous people on the terrorist watch list. The getaways are just insane. Like how many millions of people have entered that we weren't able to catch. How many terrorists and drug traffickers are among them? I think it's 90% of all the opioids that are coming out of like Central and South America come through Mexico into the U.S. And the U.S. has I think it's 65% roughly of the whole world's opium consumer demand, but for like the Americas, it's much, much higher than that. So we've got just tons and tons of drugs, like literally tons of these drugs coming across the border. I do believe in I'm a libertarian. I do believe in letting people make their own mistakes. I mean, I think doing these drugs is a horrible life choice. It's dangerous. It's hard to be productive. It's bad for an economy. But in a free society, I think you let people make decisions. But some of these drugs are so dangerous that there are negative externalities that have to be controlled, right? Like I believe in the Second Amendment, and I believe in everyone's ability to have a gun to protect themselves. But I don't think everybody should be able to have a nuclear weapon, right? Because of the
Right.
externalities. And the same thing is true for drugs. There's some, like, these opioids are so powerful, like fentanyl, for example, which you hear about all the time, is 50 times as potent as heroin. But there's analogs where they tweak like one little piece of it, right? And so it's chemically different, so it technically doesn't fall under as the same drug. But there's some that are much stronger, like carfentanil is 100 times, 50 or 100 times, I think it's 100 times stronger than fentanyl. And carfentanil was originally designed as a weapon of mass destruction. Like it's an opioid narcotic analgesic like fentanyl, but it was used to anesthetize major animals like elephants and big farm animals. So if you enough fentanyl to fit on the head of a pin can cause an overdose in a person, right? So I mean, we're talking little specks of fentanyl. If you were to touch it, and it can go transdermal entry into your system, you can overdose and die. Carfentanil, if you took a handful of it and threw it on a subway train, everybody's dead. Like it's a very serious drug. So you can't have it completely uncontrolled, right? So even if you believe in legalization, and I do for many drugs, but not this, it's way too dangerous. If that drug, I mean, you couldn't be in public areas if that drug was everywhere. It's far too dangerous.
One of the scary statistics that I heard was basically saying that now the overwhelming majority of the drugs coming into the US are fentanyl, and they're not your typical, cocaine or heroin that, cocaine people use as an entertainment, social activity once in a while, and, it's addictive, but not to everyone, and not necessarily to the extent that some other drugs are, and whatever. So how true is it? Has fentanyl completely overwhelmed all other forms of drugs? How did this happen, and what does that mean for products coming in from Afghanistan? Are they in competition with this Chinese produced, largely Chinese produced fentanyl? Have they been kind of switched over to the production of fentanyl like drugs? How does that work exactly?
So opiates, right? Like
Mhm.
heroin are come from poppy seeds. Opioids, which are narcotics, also narcotic analgesics, are man-made, right? So they're made in a laboratory. So yes, the fentanyl has kind of overrun everything, and the reason for it is it's cheaper and it's more accessible. And so fentanyl is in a lot of, like, somebody takes heroin in thinking they're taking heroin, but it has some percentage of fentanyl in it because it's cheaper and stronger, so the profit margins are higher. The problem is it's so much more potent that unless that is carefully controlled, you don't know what dosage you're getting, right? So that's why you're seeing such a huge amount of overdoses. And I mean, it's really it's tragic, but it's in everything. Like it's in any kind of analgesic, you can find you find it in fake pills, right? They that's why it's so hard to control too, because you have like pill making presses, and you have all the components to make these drugs being shipped individually. They come through transshipment countries. It doesn't necessarily have to be like a bag of fentanyl coming across the border. It can come through freight forward companies where it comes with one markings, goes to a freight forward, gets repackaged, and then sent in. It can come in components, and then it can be produced in the United States itself. It can come in so many different ways. It can be sent, it can be even come in legally. Remember, fentanyl is a wonderful drug when it's used in surgery, right? Or post-surgery. Like, it's a great painkiller, but it's the abuse of it, which is the problem. And so, even pharmaceutical companies that get it, but then sell it directly to like pill mills, which are, either forging prescriptions or just giving it to whoever wants it without any kind of control. That's another way it gets into the system. So there are problems with it. And my argument is not so much, from the effect on the person using the drug, although that's bad. And because it's illegal, it's actually worse, right? Because the quality is not controlled. but it's on the externalities that come from that. And then we started this conversation with the whole narco-terrorism piece. When you have these illicit organizations, drug trafficking organizations, they have to use force to exist, right? If you're a fentanyl dealer in Detroit, and somebody comes to take your money or your drugs, you have to defend yourself. You can't call the police and say someone's trying to steal my fentanyl business, right? So you have to have this extra legal use of force as part of it. It's inherent in any kind of illicit enterprise like that. So by making drug sales illegal, you immediately have this underground violence, right? This illegal violence that we saw it in prohibition with alcohol. It has to become part of it because they have to protect themselves. So there's all kinds of these negative externalities that happen, but overdose deaths, I would argue, would be far less if it was a legal drug that came through a doctor and came through a pharmacy, just because of the quality control itself. Although the counter argument to that is that more people would end up getting hooked and addicted, because it is very addictive. Fentanyl is psychologically and physically addicting, and it happens very quickly.
So for a while, we heard a lot about overprescription of Oxycontin and how many people were getting addicted, and there was no way to really measure the pain, and so the doctors were overprescribing, and they were getting all sorts of incentives to experiment with the painkillers and things like that, even people who did not necessarily need them, and so on and so forth. All of a sudden, all of that has disappeared, and all we're hearing is about fentanyl, especially Chinese fentanyl coming over the border. What has happened to the previous crisis? Has it really gone away? And how do the traditional drug dealers fit into the picture? Are they working with these artificial drug producers?
So
Mhm.
there's two pieces of that, right? So the overprescription, or dealing through pill mills, or bad doctors who are just basically selling prescriptions, right? That's one problem through a legal pathway that's then exploited. The other one is like illegal production and illegal importation. So drug traffickers, almost all of it, unless you're getting a package of fentanyl shipped directly from like an illegal lab in China, unless you're getting it that way, it's coming through a drug trafficking organization. So a lot of these organizations from the Sinaloa cartel, right, that's completely turned Mexico into a narco state, well, all of them are using it because there's a huge profit margin to be involved here. And so in many ways, the fentanyl's taken over the heroin, but they work together. Like, I don't know the number now because it changes all the time, but a huge percentage of heroin seized in the United States has traces of fentanyl in it, right? So it's used to augment and increase the potency of the heroin itself. So the legal in the over prescription, and there are doctors who do this. There are pill mills that do this. There are companies that are just looking at profit, so they don't care. They're just pushing it out the door. But there's been a huge reaction to that as well, right? Where it's actually hard to get the painkillers people need went after a surgery, for example, because doctors are so scared of the government cracking down on them and taking their license or having criminal charges. So, I mean, if anyone who's had a surgery and has tried to get some of these painkillers afterwards knows how difficult. They're rationed out a few pills at a time. And there's a legitimate concern because the pills are so physically and psychologically addictive that you want to get people off them as quickly as possible, but also it's a miracle painkiller that people need in certain circumstances. So in some ways there's been a huge overreaction to how we're cracking down on the way drugs by legitimate doctors, like the government's interfering between the doctor and the patient in many ways, right? And putting pressure on the doctor not to prescribe something that doctor believes the patient needs. But there are many doctors also who are acting immorally and unethically, and who are doing it just to make money. So those two things can kind of coexist at the same time. And then the illicit market is a whole different thing, and that's where there's no quality control. That's where there's all the violence that comes. I mean, pill mills and things don't necessarily have that same level because they're working with legitimate companies. They're just overprescribing. But MS-13 or a group that's selling these drugs that were manufactured either in the United States or in Mexico, using Chinese precursors or even using fentanyl that came directly from China, that's a whole different ball game, and that's obviously a huge problem. And legalization won't fix that problem because of the externalities I talked about.
So let's focus. Let's then come back to China and their role in all of in this creation of deliberate creation of this crisis. This hasn't happened overnight, although it feels like it has. We were hearing about fentanyl here and there, and all of a sudden there's a huge crisis. How did it happen so quickly? Was it literally during the more recent border openness situation, or how has it increased exponentially?
It's because of the profit margins, and I
Mhm.
mean, there's huge in the slowness of the Chinese government to like work with the American government to like criminalize the analogs, right? In large, like drugs that have the same effect, but they're off chemically a little bit, could be treated the same way under law, right? But they're not in China. But I mean, I would listen. China, as I mentioned earlier, has no motivation to stop this at all. It's hurting us. It's costing us billions of dollars. It's costing us lost revenue. It's damaging the economy. It's damaging the culture, right? It's killing Americans. Like it's doing a lot. It's doing a lot of damage to our country, and it's getting worse and worse and worse. So that actually helps China because they're a global competitor in a lot of ways. And this is a horrible communist dictatorship, right? I mean, they've literally have slave camps. Like this is a bad or a really bad government. And so, but even if they wanted to, they could crack down. They're a tyrannical government. They could crack down a lot more than they're doing, and they should. But they ever completely eradicate it? Probably not. It's a strong central government with central planning, but you have local provinces and local towns, and they rely on these levels of government to control what's happening in the towns. But because of the central planning, these local provinces, or these local regional areas are also under mandates to produce. And so a lot of the production is coming like legitimately through opioid production. Not, remember, opioids are legal, right? It's just some of them are not in the way that they're manufactured. And then even you can manufacture drugs. Anyone who's seen Breaking Bad understands, right? How you can have like these little pill mills, and you can have very small mills that pick up and move from place to place. All that you need is the know-how and the precursor chemicals. And the precursor chemicals exist because there's a huge, tens of billions of dollars. I think it's $40 billion globally in the opioid business. It might be closer to 50 billion at this point. So there's this huge market for legal opioids. And then so taking some of those precursors and manufacturing them separately, and then selling them either directly to criminal gangs or directly to customers in some cases, like on the dark web. They can send directly to customers in the US, or going through these transshipment countries or selling to other criminal groups. They can get it into the hands of users. So it's a huge moneymaker, and it's an addictive drug. So people who get addicted to it generally don't stop. It just gets worse and worse, and they build up tolerances and need more and more of the drug. The open border was throwing gasoline on the fire. That's where the drugs are coming from in this country predominantly. They're coming across that border. So not having a controlled border where what materials and people are coming across is a huge problem.
So we keep hearing stories of somebody's dog accidentally finding it on the ground, somebody's kid touching it and putting it in its mouth and overdosing and or whatever. How does this? You've never heard stories like that previously with drugs. Most of the time, you can't just find cocaine or even crack cocaine lying around in files. It's
Well,
definitely.
like during the crack epidemic, you did, right? There were you would
Mhm,
you would find crack pipes, and there were it's because the people who are taking the drugs are not being, they're not the most responsible when they're on
mhm.
the drugs, right? They might be okay off it, but certainly not when they're actually on the drugs. But it's so prolific at this point, and that's why you're seeing it. Also because the media is all about narrative, right? So when these instances come up and they fit a narrative, they talk about it. Anything that's fear mongering, anything that's extreme, anything that makes somebody sitting at home who has a job and a family and a somewhat normal life, anything that can scare them gets clicks, right? And so that's what the media does. So I think a lot of that, that fentanyl lying on the ground. I mean, how often does that really happen? It's valuable, right? It has value,
Mhm.
but certainly it's an epidemic and it's everywhere. And police officers are, I mean, they carry Narcan kits with them, so if there's an overdose, they can immediately administer this drug to counteract the effects of it. It's very effective if you get to somebody right away. But police officers who are arresting people put the hand in the pocket and will touch fentanyl, and they'll overdose. It happens all the time. It's a huge problem, and I think, you know, in some ways it's so understated in the political discourse, because the people in the back of their minds, when they think drugs, they're thinking marijuana, right? They're having the libertarian arguments, which I'm very sensitive to, you know, but something like this is so powerful, and that's why you're seeing so many fatalities from it. I mean, you know, heroin's bad. Heroin is a strong drug, as we all recognize. Fentanyl's 50 times stronger.
So, has the drug education here failed that there is such a great demand for for fentanyl, despite its addictive qualities, harmful effects, and the number of overdoses that we all hear about? Why is there still a willingness to experiment, to try it, to to get into it, even among the people among first-time users? And why are people who are using other drugs not more careful, not knowing that it's a factor and that they may not know that it's mixed in with other things?
Well, I mean, the
Can
people
that
who
be a
are,
deterrent in terms of drug usage?
if you're an addict, if you're addicted to this physically or psychologically or both, you don't think rationally when you're thinking about taking the drug. You might understand the risk, but you're doing it anyhow.
Mhm.
It overcomes the receptors in your brain, right? It simulates pleasure. And if you do it long enough, you can even kill the pleasure centers in your brain, where you're only able to feel pleasure from this drug, right? Like these drugs are, drug abuse is not a good thing. You know, I mean, drugs are miracles in so many ways, but drug abuse is not a good thing. Your broader question about why are people trying it the first time, and why, I mean, I think that's more of a cultural issue. You know, it's people try drugs for peer pressure. They try drugs because they're in despair, because of depression. I mean, the depression rates, the suicidality in our culture is through the roof right now. And there's a lot of factors involved with that, from, you know, broken families, you know, to economic issues, and to, you know, to the dissolution of institutions like the church. You know, like people have, there's a lot of things that people have traditionally hung on to, right? Whether whatever religion, family units, you know, small centralized communities. These things are now have given way to like a bigger, broader government that seems more intrusive and more federal in a lot of ways, and less responsive to what people like individually want. So I think there's a lot of cultural issues that are involved with why people want to try drugs.
So what is then the answer? We are seeing that on the one hand, there is a kind of a political narrative ignoring some of the traditional drug dealers and the fact that they're still out there making money and using it for even worse things. On the other hand, you have this economic drug war on us. There's the war on drugs and there's a drug war against us that we are not really seeing as a something to push back on by other warlike means. And this is a hostile step, and yet we haven't figured out the exact response that we could manufacture to China and whoever else is involved in order to stop this economic decision making to pursue this strategy against us. I don't know whether sanctions are the answer. I do know that the other day a huge group of members of Congress voted against a bill that would make it more difficult to import fentanyl into the U.S. for reasons that are not clear why they would do that. Why would anyone want fentanyl to continue flowing? I mean, I just don't really understand what was wrong with that bill.
Well, you'll see politicians voting against bills that they originally sponsored because the other party is now promoting it, right? So you'll see that extreme partisanship, where even if, I mean, you saw this when Trump, and I'm not a fan, right? But when Trump became president, and some of his first immigration, you know, bills he wanted to push were literally what the Democrats were looking for. and they voted against it because it was him, right? It's so you see that all the time. So extreme partisanship in both parties, right? That's part of it. I think we're lacking a moral clarity. What our country stands for, right? The American exceptionalism, the individual freedom, the things that our country was really based on. If your whole political platform is based on why America and the West is bad and why we're the worst thing to happen to the world, it's really hard for you to understand what we stand for, right? And the reason I say that is because it's a country like China, there's no ambiguity here. China is a horrible, repressive, genocidal, communist dictatorship. Like they are the enemy to everything that our country stands for. And for us to not be able to articulate that and not be able to recognize them as the global enemy that they are and the threat they are to Taiwan and to the entire chip market, the threat that they are around the world, and that as we pull back from places, which I know a lot of people who agree with me on libertarian issues are supportive of, like pulling back globally. But what you do is when you create a vacuum, China steps in, and you don't want to have a communist country stepping in a role of world leadership, which is what they're doing all over the place. They're doing it in Africa, they're doing it in the Middle East. And our lack of leadership over the last couple of years has created this vacuum and allowed some of the worst dictators on earth to step up and become more aggressive. So I think, what do you do with like China, for instance, and the opioids? You recognize it as an act of war, right? It's something that they're actively doing and they know what they're doing, and you stop it. You have to control your borders, right? I'm very pro immigration, right? But you have to you have to know who's coming in and what's coming in, and we're not doing that. So, is it hard to control border? Of course. Can you completely stop it? No, but you can get it back to levels where we can control it, where it's manageable. You can also take legislative measures. This stuff's illegal, right? But we've for some reason in law enforcement across the board, we look at like racial inequities in outcomes to as proof of like racial prejudice in the laws themselves. And historically, there's some truth to some of that, but just because like one racial group has a higher level of criminality doesn't mean that the law itself is wrong. There's racial disparities in homicide, but homicide is not a racially motivated law. And so, and the reason I mention that piece is because that's part of this whole, if it's nonviolent, we're going to let you out of jail, right? So you're seeing that in cities around the country. It's been going on for years, since 2016. And so if you want to stop the spread of narcotics, illicit narcotics, and I'm talking about the ones that are really bad, like fentanyl and carfentanil and things. If you want to do that, then you could legalize fentanyl to a degree, and it would help in many ways. But for the drugs that are too strong, that can't be legalized, and fentanyl could be that drug too, right? But certainly carfentanil and these other analogs, to that extent, you have to put people in jail when they're violating the law. You can't, and the same thing's true with like expelling people who've crossed the border illegally with drugs and then been turned back. I mean, you see that all the time, right? People being deported 3-4 times without doing something to them. If it's beyond just labor, someone's coming across to illegally to get a job, that I would say that's different in kind from somebody who's crossing the border with narcotics or crossing the border with weapons. So if you want to stop the fentanyl crisis, you have to take it seriously. For one, you have to talk about what it is. You have to increase education. You have to seal our borders. You have to try to stop the source countries that are supplying it. And you have to deal with like the cartels, which are essentially terror organizations. Not essentially, they are terrorist organizations in Mexico. And these are the ones who are driving the vast majority of the drugs across our border. So you have to deal with them too, directly. Like, we tend to not want to do that, but they're killing Americans, and not just Americans who want to get drugs and are getting a drug that's adulterated with fentanyl to a potency level they didn't understand, but they're like actually killing Americans too on the southwest border. There's these are dangerous criminal organizations who murder and assassinate Mexican judges and police and have completely corrupted that government. And you can't let them grow, and they're right on our border, and they're causing huge levels of crime in this country too. So treat them as those criminal organizations as the enemies that they are as well.
I do believe there was a proposal to designate the some specific hotels as terrorist organizations, which did not, to my knowledge, succeed so far, at least. I don't know if they'll succeed later. But I want to ask you one more serious question before kind of talking a little bit more about some more fun things like your writing and your projects you're working on, which is we don't typically think of China as a terrorism sponsoring state because China has positioned itself through public rhetoric as a stabilizer who is counter to destabilization by terrorist organizations in the Middle East and so forth. We think of Islamist groups as terrorists, or maybe some radicalized right-wing groups, or some radicalized, left-wing groups. We don't really think of China in that capacity. We think of China as many, many things, but not China and terror. And yet, to some extent, first of all, this drug sponsorship goes hand in hand with narco-terrorism and terrorist entities. And on the other hand, you can almost think of it as some of it as an act of political terror, or could become an act of political terror if used in certain ways. So how do we expose this relationship between China and its state decisions to allow this to happen, and maybe even uncover some specific encouragement and not just merely a policy of non-enforcement, and groups and terrorist organizations that benefit from it and that work with it to implement this process?
I mean, understanding what China is and what they stand for, you just have to listen to these organizations and countries to understand it. It blows my mind when, like, you have the Taliban openly talking about what their goals are, and then you have people in the media or this administration making excuses for them. They're telling you what they want to do. The Muslim Brotherhood tells you what they want to do. China tells you what they want to do, right? They want to be the sole hegemonic power on the globe. They terrorize their own people all the time. Talk about terrorism. How about you speak out against the government and you end up in a camp, or you're executed, or your social score is reduced so much that nobody else in society can touch you, or else their social scores are also reduced. I mean, this is Orwellian stuff, and they don't hide the ball. They have slave camps of the Uyghurs, right? Like, I mean, people just tend to forget that when they talk about that, right? We need that moral clarity. You need to say, this is not what our country stands for, and we won't associate with it. And this whole idea that's gone on for so many years of, this, oh, we'll work with you because you'll work with us again. You just have to stand for something. And I think once you start there, it makes everything so much easier. And if countries want to change, you could certainly reward them with their, with changing and improving their human rights record. Like, I think we should always be open to that. The country's not your enemy, doesn't have to be your enemy forever. But, until they show that, and you certainly don't want to do it through bribery or concessions. Concessions to a totalitarian regime like China just encourages them to get more aggressive. I mean, we've seen this around the world. Look at the state of the world now compared to like 3 years ago. It's on every single front, things have just completely fallen apart. Our enemies are on the march, and we have to start paying attention to that.
Well, that certainly gives us a lot to think about, and I really hope that everyone listening will heed your message and push their lawmakers and administrations to act accordingly and to keep it in mind. Our security is at stake, and quite frankly, there's no reason to show weakness. There's no long-term political advantage from it. There's literally none. It doesn't. Acting from a place of weakness is not helpful and doesn't solve any of these problems at all. As far as I see, nothing's been solved by these decisions. But I want to step away a little bit from these politics and more towards cultural aspect of it, because politics, as they say, is downstream from culture, and having the discussion of security issues or fight against terrorism and narcotics and narco-terrorism, they certainly also can impact a lot the way people think about politics and how they think about their decisions. So once you left the DA and decided to go into writing, what was that process like? About what basically inspired you to write your first works, and how did you end up doing uh, those particular subjects, and how do you find what you want to write about next?
Well, you know, I wanted to be a writer since I was like 6 years old. I remember doing that as a kid and just being inspired by stories. And I think people who tell stories are it's something either, I guess it's nature versus nurture, right? But I remember my parents telling me stories when I was a little kid and just being transported, and maybe being an only child for the first 7 years of my life had something to do with it. So I did a lot of reading. So I always wanted to do that. And I started as a journalist, you know, and I knew I was going to get there, but you know, I ended up in 25 years in law enforcement, and that it was difficult to be, you know, running around like the world. I was for, you know, I was traveling all over the world going after high value targets for many years, and really difficult to write and do that. And also with my security clearances, it was difficult. So you know, when I retired as a special agent, I was able to finally do the thing I wanted to do. So I'm very excited about it. You know, I write thrillers. I have a published psychological thriller, Furious Sailing into Terror. It's one of a bunch of awards. And then I have a crime thriller, Unseen, Evil Lurks Among Us, which is based on a real life terror conspiracy. I have two books coming out next year with different publishers in 2024. Both one's a traditional mystery, but it's somewhat of a psychological thriller too. It's a mystery thriller, and then the other one's a techno thriller involving artificial intelligence. And then I have a new literary agent, so I'm working on a trilogy with an eye on Hollywood, for that involves a historical narrative as well. So I'm pretty excited about that. And I have two other books, a psychological thriller and then another techno thriller, which I'm going to shop this year. So, well, you know, I might self-publish one too, just to see how that goes. I know an author who's done really well with self-published psychological thrillers, and I'm doing one thing with my agent, you know, and it might be fun to do like the separate subgenre on my own.
This sounds like so much fun, and you seem to have a very diverse um, subject matter that you are able to tap into. Does it all come from your professional experience, or do you go beyond your direct involvement? Because a lot of it seems to be more even straight into the depths of terrorism and not just strictly narco related.
Yeah, I mean, some of that, like when my crime fiction has certainly, you know, been based a lot of my own experiences, right, in law enforcement. But a lot of, you know, everything I've written, all writers tap into their personal experience, and then it's using your imagination to go a step farther. So the Furious Sailing into Terror, that one, you know, I've done some blue water sailing. I love to sail, you know, and so, you know, there is some personal experience involved with that. You know, all my books, there's a little bit of me in them, right? All the characters have a little bit of me in them somehow. And so, you know, but no, they're not all about terrorism. They're not all about that. So I might end up writing under a pen name. We'll see what happens with this next series, because, you know, you want to carry your audience along with you. So if you're writing a bunch of psychological suspense, you know, those same people may not be interested in crime fiction or a military thriller or that kind of thing. So I might end up having to have two different brands going simultaneously.
And I'm going to ask you something a little bit provocative. Have any of the individuals from the criminal slash terrorism world ever gotten back to you? Have they ever had read anything that you've written and
Yes.
responded in some way?
Great question.
I know
Yes.
it's a strange question to ask, but
I had there was a member of a Dominican drug trafficking organization in New York who I had arrested many years ago. And then actually when I went to arrest him with a group of guys, and he took off and rammed my car, and I got into a high speed chase with him through the Bronx, and he ended up losing control of his car, and this was like in the middle of the night, and hitting a traffic light and then driving through the front of a restaurant. And I got out on foot and chased him, and then we got into a fight, and he tried to get my gun, and I ended up splitting an artery in his head. I mean, it was just a mess. And but then he became an informant, and I worked with him for years after that. And so he reached out to me after he saw my writing, just to touch base and see what I was doing. And you know, and it's funny, you know, you know, even the worst bad guys. I mean, I've sat and had tea with mass murderers before, you know, but everyone's human on some level, right? There's sociopaths, and there's people who have very little humanity in them. But it's especially if you're looking at people who are like profit driven and not necessarily that violent, even though they're unethical and immoral. There's always some part of them that's human that you can relate to. So when I would I would develop human informant networks around the world. So when I go and sit down with somebody, and you have to talk somebody into infiltrating a terror group and putting their life on the line and recording terrorists, and it's a big deal. You have to learn to connect to them on a human level. So yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I've had several informants that I've dealt with over the years reach back out to me, and now that I'm more public with my writing.
That's great, actually. I think for a lot of people, that's kind of almost a hallmark of success, because that's how you know what you're saying is kind of real, and it reaches all sorts of people, not just, the usual kind of suspects that you might expect to listen to that. And then another question I'm always curious with writers. I know that you mentioned that a lot. Some of the things are obviously based on kind of real life stories on yourself, or cases that you dealt with. But to what extent do you ever put your direct, people you really personally dislike or like into the stories as characters? Do you ever do that, or is it more like a composite kind of thing that's makes
It's more
sense for the story?
composite. It's definitely a composite. But yes, I have you have people with good or bad qualities, or people who've done things, or quirkiness about somebody that you might make a piece of a character. Sure. I always take it. I always take it from real life, and even the story ideas, right? Like I'll see stuff in the newspaper, and I think writers do this a lot. But I always ask, but what if, and I think of something, or you hear something that sounds weird, and you're like, I wonder if there's a different explanation for that, and that's where a lot of these story ideas come from.
So now, my last question is about what you mentioned about going to Hollywood with some of your work. Um, One interesting pattern I've noticed in a lot of Hollywood productions related to terror is a lot of them are kind of, end up being plot lines where it's either a domestic conspiracy from within, US owned agencies, or the terrorists are completely fictional to the point that they don't resemble anything even remotely related to reality, just some nuts, crazy environmentalist groups, or people with grudges, who are just, almost humorous. There are some in US culture, there are certainly some gritty lines, but a lot of them are so heavily fictionalized and affected by kind of wishful thinking and interpretation of political lines, that they have little to do with the way these things work, and that makes them less fun. Are you concerned about your work being kind of pushed into the direction when it comes to big or small screen, that it will be kind of almost changed to fit some basically cliches and standards that are now in common tropes in Hollywood concerning these topics?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So as a writer, when you write the book, you write what you want to write. So the book is mine. If we sell the rights to Hollywood on a particular story, they can kind of do with it what they want, and I think that's the best advice I've heard from a lot of like really big name authors I've spoken to about who've done these huge 7-figure deals with Hollywood. And they're like, it becomes, when you're writing as an author, it's you in a room, right? Then of course your agent has input and your editor and whatever, but it's really coming from your mind. In Hollywood, it's a group project, and everyone wants to put their thumbprint on it. Every producer wants to change things, and there's often numerous writers from the life of a project from the beginning to the end. So the best advice for like a novelist, I think, is just sell it, enjoy the money you get from it, hope they do a good job with it. But it's a different creature, right? It's a different medium. The way people interpret it's different. Like when you read a story, the story's in your head. Like you are creating the story yourself. That's the magic of writing. That is, I mean, I love Netflix and Hulu and things like that, but it's a different experience. One's passive, one's active, and the active one will always be better because it's created in your own mind, and it's why there's a connection between every author and every reader. Every reader reads that story differently, and it's really interesting to talk to readers and see what they thought about it. Sometimes I barely will describe a character, but they have a very clear image of that character in their head. I don't know if you've ever read a book you really enjoyed, then it's coming out as a movie, and then you see the portrayal or the actor, and they're like, that's not what that guy looks like, you know. That's because, I mean, sometimes you're the only one who has that image in your head, but that's the beauty of writing, you know. So letting it go is a good thing, but you know, I can control what I write, and I believe, like, in writing in general, specifics are better than generalities, and doing things that actually mirror reality is so much better, and readers know it when they read it. You know, so I don't believe in this, you know, in political correctness. I believe in just writing something that's good and gritty, and that people will enjoy. The whole point of my thrillers is to give people thrills, and so I hope that's what they get.
Well, I hope in a future conversation we actually can get more specifically in discussing your books, your writings, and I hope our readers check them out before we kind of. I don't also want to go too much into specifics before people get a chance to read them and enjoy them for themselves. But will be very much keeping a lookout on these further developments, and I hope we'll get to discuss them in the near future as well. Thank you so much for joining us today. This was a remarkable conversation, and I think I hope many people get kind of a glimpse of the reality from it, from beyond the headlines and beyond the coverage and in political hearings in Congress, which don't always reflect anything beyond the agendas of the specific people in question. For those who were watching the program, this was the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. We'll be back again next Tuesday at 9 p.m. with you was Irina Zuckerman, the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a wonderful night.
Thank you.